The Prime Minister steps into the dispute with junior doctors in England as hospitals prepare for more strikes this month. A 5-day walkout's planned over their new contract. Theresa May's accused the British Medical Association of playing politics rather than putting patients first. Also on the programme this lunchtime, a 10-year-old boy and his aunt who were killed when a car being chased by police ploughed into them. After a Brexit slump, a surprise bounce back for UK manufacturing last month, the sharpest rebound for 25 years. Taking the hard line, US presidential candidate Donald Trump insists he would make Mexico pay for a wall to prevent migrants crossing into the US.
Well, I can't see how she's going to continue, Chris, quite honestly. I mean, that was almost a total collapse on court.
But continue she did, the extraordinary comeback by Britain's Johanna Konta at the US Open.
In the south, gathering in the early hours, emergency crews and family pay their respects as a body's removed from the rubble of Didcot Power Station. And a £20 million task force to get to grips with Southern Rail. But will it work?
Good afternoon and welcome to the BBC News at 1. The Prime Minister has accused the British Medical Association of playing politics rather than putting patients first. Junior doctors in England plan to hold 5 consecutive days of strikes this month after the government imposed a new pay and working hours contract on them. The contract's due to come into effect in October. But Theresa May said the deal was safe for patients and the NHS had record levels of funding and a record number of doctors. Here's our health correspondent Robert Piggott.
Save our NHS! Save our NHS!
There've been 6 days of strikes by junior doctors this year, but now they're taking the NHS into uncharted territory. The latest action will affect all services, accident and emergency included, from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. on each day from the 12th to the 16th of September. NHS leaders say 100,000 operations and 1 million appointments could be affected.
NHS trusts deal with 1 million patients every 36 hours. We've only had 12 days notice of this strike, much less than we've ever had before, and it's going to be for 5 days. So if you think about the number of patients that's likely to affect, it's going to be several hundreds of thousands of people who will receive a worse quality of care as a result of this strike.
The Health Secretary, Jeremy Hunt, has denounced the strike as totally irresponsible and devastating for patients. This morning, the Prime Minister gave Mr Hunt powerful backing, saying the deal he worked out was safe for patients. Junior doctors say the contract, imposed on them by the government, penalises part-time staff and those who work the most weekends. They claim it will exacerbate existing difficulties recruiting medical staff and do much more damage to NHS services than their strike. But patients have warned that public sympathy could ebb.
The question is, does it justify strike action? I think people are going to be increasingly puzzled as to why the doctors are going on strike again when the position that they had vis-à-vis the government didn't seem that far apart at an earlier stage. I think the public's sympathy is going to slowly trickle away if there isn't a clear kind of game plan for bringing the dispute to an end.
The BMA struck a deal with the government in May, but that was rejected by junior doctors in July. Perhaps because of that history, it seems that the BMA Council was divided over this latest dramatic escalation in the dispute. It's declined to comment on reports that the final vote was by just 16 to 14, but it has said that it came at the end of a long and difficult debate. Junior doctors say they're striking only as a last resort after repeated attempts to work with the government.
We're devastated that the government has not listened to junior doctors. They have not listened to the concerns that we still have. They've not listened to the rejection of the contract, and we've been left with no other choice than to take further industrial action.
Junior doctors say they'd stop the strike today, but only if the government reverses its decision to impose the contract on them. The government says it will talk only if the strike is called off. The stage is set for a prolonged and bitter struggle. Robert Piggott, BBC News.
Our health editor Hugh Pym is here. How significant is the Prime Minister's intervention in this?
Well, Sophie, I think very significant because in so many ways this is all very familiar, isn't it? The same row which dates back many months, the same arguments over the contract. Jeremy Hunt is still the Health Secretary. The BMA leadership is largely unchanged at the top with Dr. Mark Porter, but the Prime Minister has changed. Theresa May has taken over, and we hadn't heard exactly what she thought about this dispute, whether she might have thought of going back to the table and taking another look. Now, the fact that she reappointed Jeremy Hunt as Health Secretary back in July does tell us that she had faith in the way he'd handled it. And this morning she's come out and, in answer to questions, said he is an excellent Health Secretary, and she's accused the BMA of playing politics. In other words, there's no sign from what she's saying of any backing down from the stance set out already by the government.
So the next strike is at short notice. It's soon. It's 5 consecutive days. How likely is it that that will now go ahead?
Yes, Monday week for 5 days. The last time there was an all-out strike by junior doctors, it was 2 days, so it's quite an escalation in that sense. I think given what Theresa May has said this morning, it seems very unlikely the government will be saying to the BMA, sure, back in for another chat. Government sources are saying there were informal discussions over the summer about some of the outstanding issues, for example on weekend pay, but the BMA didn't respond and have just come out with these planned strikes. So it doesn't look as if there's going to be any further talks. The BMA view is that the members voted against the last contract and the government have refused to engage in any way with trying to take things forward.
Hugh Pym, thank you. Tributes have been paid to the 10-year-old boy and his 34-year-old aunt who were killed yesterday afternoon in London when a car being chased by police ploughed into them. Micaiah McDermott and Rosie Cooper were walking on the pavement with 3 other children when they were hit. Police are continuing to question a man in connection with their deaths. Richard Lister reports.
Fun, popular and naturally gifted actor who'd have gone on to great things. Some of the tributes paid to 10-year-old Micaiah McDermott, struck and killed by an allegedly stolen car. His aunt, 34-year-old Rosie Cooper, was also killed. Her daughter and 2 nieces were also hurt. Around 20 people surrounded the car and managed to lift it off the trapped children, but paramedics and the air ambulance service were unable to save Micaiah or his aunt. The car's driver fled the scene. Police say he was the only one in the vehicle at the time of the accident. 2 police cars had been in pursuit of the Ford Fiesta after it was reported stolen. A 23-year-old man remains in custody on suspicion of causing death by dangerous driving. All day, friends, neighbours and well-wishers have been coming with flowers to leave at the spot, which has brought such trauma to this community.
I don't know Rosie massively well, but the one thing I do know about her is she never had a bad word to say about anybody. She was the kindest, friendliest, warmest person.
Even for those who don't know the family personally, this has been a place to pause, to reflect, to pray.
This is most disturbing, most upsetting. I myself, as a minister, did not sleep a wink last night as a consequence of this horrific event. So I've just come down, quite literally, I'm going to work now, to pray for the family.
Micaiah went to a local stage school and had hopes of becoming a professional actor. 2 members of the same family lost in just a few seconds of carnage. Well, the 3 injured girls, understood to be Micaiah's twin 13-year-old sisters and his 8-year-old cousin, remain in hospital, though we understand their injuries are not life-threatening. The police say a 23-year-old man remains in custody in a South London police station. He's still being questioned on suspicion of causing death by dangerous driving and vehicle theft. Sophie?
Richard Lister, thank you. There's been a sharp rebound in manufacturing in the UK last month. It bounced back unexpectedly strongly following a slump in July after the Brexit vote. And one of the big reasons for it is the weaker pound, making our goods cheaper for foreign companies to buy. Our economics correspondent Andy Verity is here, and these figures have come as quite a surprise, haven't they?
Yeah, they've really taken economists aback, Sophie. They really didn't predict that they'd be this good. In July, we had the worst number in 3.5 years. So everyone said, oh, it's terrible after Brexit. Brexit. Now they're having to eat their words, really. This just looks at purchasing managers. So these are the executives within companies who have to decide what supplies to buy to meet the orders coming into the company. And they're asked, are your orders getting better, worse, or just the same? And if more than 50% of them say they're getting better, that's a really good sign. So the index has shown that, for example, we've got a 53.3 reading, and that's up by 5 points. This index doesn't wobble around that much. That's the biggest increase in the 25-year history of this. So much better than most economists were expecting. And it's partly stimulated by the weak pound because, as you say, foreign customers can buy the goods made by British companies more cheaply. It acts as a stimulus, a better stimulus perhaps than the ultra-low interest rates we've had for years now. But there is a downside, of course, of a weak pound. If the pound doesn't buy you as many euros, then whenever you want to buy something in euros, you have to have more pounds, and that means inflation of import prices. And the manufacturers are also saying that 44% of them, they're paying higher prices for their supplies, and that will be passed on to us. You're already seeing higher prices at the factory gate. Eventually, that will come through to the supermarket shelves.
Andy, thank you. The US presidential candidate Donald Trump has insisted that Mexico will pay to build a border wall between the two countries during a major speech on immigration. There were expectations that Mr. Trump would use the event to soften his stance on immigration policy. Instead, he set out a hard-hitting plan to curb illegal immigration, as Laura Bicker reports.
The rumours were wrong. There is to be no pivot, no softening of his stance. Donald Trump is holding his course on immigration, starting with the policy that has become so popular with his voting base.
Are you ready? Are you ready? We will build a great wall along the southern border, and Mexico will pay for the wall, 100%.
As for the millions in the country illegally, Mr. Trump says it's time for them to leave. Only then can they apply to come back. Illegal immigrants who've committed crimes will be hunted down.
I am going to create a new special deportation task force focused on identifying and quickly removing the most dangerous criminal illegal immigrants in America who have evaded justice, just like Hillary Clinton has evaded justice, okay?
If Donald Trump becomes president, there will be no amnesty. No one will be immune from enforcement, he says, and those seeking entry will only be allowed in if they have the correct credentials.
I call it extreme vetting, right? Extreme vetting. I want extreme. It's going to be so tough. And if somebody comes in, that's fine, but they're going to be good. It's extreme. And if people don't like it, we got to have a country, folks. Got to have a country.
This was a very different tone to the one he'd taken earlier with the Mexican president on a surprise visit.
We did discuss the wall. We didn't discuss payment of the wall. That'll be for a later date. This was a very preliminary meeting. I think it was an excellent meeting.
However, this was disputed by President Peña Nieto, who said on Twitter, "At the beginning of the conversation with Donald Trump, I made it clear Mexico would not pay for the wall." Just one more controversy in a campaign which has already defied the odds. This speech is his latest gamble. Mr. Trump needs moderates and minorities to beat Hillary Clinton, but it's unclear whether such a hard line will help him win the White House. Laura Bicker, BBC News, Washington.
From today, people who don't own a television but use the BBC's iPlayer to catch up on programmes must pay for a TV licence. Previously, only viewers who were watching shows as they were being broadcast required a licence. The new rules close the so-called iPlayer loophole, but how easy will it be to enforce them? Here's our media correspondent David Silito.
It's estimated that more than 500,000 people watch the BBC only on the iPlayer, and until today, they didn't have to pay the licence fee. That has now changed.
We need it for watching or downloading any BBC programmes on iPlayer on any device. Same goes for any live TV.
What about on a phone or something?
Yep, on any device.
From today, anyone who watches or downloads any BBC TV content will have to pay the £145.50 licence fee. The reason for the change is because the BBC says it was facing a £150 million shortfall in its income because of the number of households that no longer have a television and were watching the BBC only on the iPlayer's catch-up service. It's less than 2% of households, but the government agreed to close what was described as a loophole in the law. However, changing the law is one thing, enforcing it is an entirely different matter.
May I see your TV licence, please?
The traditional method of detection was the detector van. Quite how it worked was never entirely clear, and that was for televisions. The online iPlayer is a completely different technology. There are concerns.
There's lots of rumours circulating around in the press implying that there's going to be tracking of people's Wi-Fi, monitoring of internet packets of data, and snooping, basically, on people as they go about their private business on the internet when they may or may not be watching iPlayer. Now, that's a big concern.
In response, TV licensing says it won't reveal its methods, but will definitely not be monitoring private Wi-Fi networks. But so far, the only visible change is this on-screen reminder when you try to use the iPlayer. David Sillito, BBC News.
The time is 1:15, our top story this lunchtime. The Prime Minister steps into the dispute with junior doctors in England, accusing the British Medical Association of playing politics rather than putting patients first. And opening in London, we go through the doors of the biggest biomedical research centre in Europe.
In South today, stretching his legs, England star Jack Wilshere arrives in Bournemouth to begin his season-long loan away from Arsenal. And she ran away to the circus, but now one of the South's former Olympians is coming home to teach new talent.
Those tight legs.
It has cost £650 million to build, and it's the biggest biomedical research centre in Europe. Today, the Francis Crick Institute in London officially opened its doors to more than 1,200 scientists who will be based there now, working on new ways to diagnose, treat and prevent conditions such as cancer, heart disease and strokes. Our correspondent Amy Cole reports.
It's the size of 17 football pitches, and by early next year, the Institute will be home to 1,250 scientists. Sir Paul Nurse, a geneticist and joint winner of the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 2001, is at the helm of this new ship.
He's transferring lots of different liquids into rubber tubes here, mixing them up.
Here, scientists from across Europe will aim to find new ways to treat, diagnose and prevent a range of common illnesses such as cancer, heart disease and stroke. But post-Brexit, is this expensive scientific venture now on shakier ground?
The vast majority of scientists were against Brexit because they knew that that would be a problem for our scientific endeavour. However, we're a great scientific nation and we are open to business across the world. It'll just be a bit more bureaucratic because of Brexit. It will cost us more because of Brexit, but we will solve those problems. We will still be a very attractive place to work.
He's certainly got his work cut out. The Francis Crick Institute has cost £650 million, but scientist Dr. Kate Bishop, who leads a team in HIV research, thinks it's money well spent.
So you'll be working along other scientists in this new building. How is that going to aid your research?
And we're doing very basic biology, trying to figure out how HIV replicates inside a cell. But it's great because there's going to be clinicians here that see HIV patients, so we can interact on a daily basis and really link it from the basic science all the way through to the clinic.
The Institute will have a budget of £130 million a year. It will be funded by a consortium including health charities and the government-funded Medical Research Council. And there's a real determination among the people working here to boost UK science and drive the country's economy. Amy Cole, BBC News.
118,000 migrants and refugees have arrived in Italy since January this year after making the perilous crossing from North Africa. 13,000 people have been picked up off the coast of Libya in the last 4 days alone. Our special correspondent Ed Thomas is in the Sicilian port of Messina, where a boat arrived on Tuesday night with about 1,000 people on board. How are the Italian authorities coping with all these people?
Sophie, the authorities, the volunteers, the Coast Guard, the police, they're all well used to dealing with this crisis, but pressure is growing now, not just here, but at ports right across southern Italy. That's because so many people are arriving now. Take this boat behind me, the one you just mentioned, and the people involved in processing the men, women and children here. 1,000 people arrived on Tuesday night, but around 400 are still here, stuck on the stern of this boat. That's because there's not the resources to deal with this amount of people, and also the migrant centres around here, they're all filling up. And Sophie, last night we were told that there was a Navy ship that had picked up around 1,000 men, women and children off the coast of Italy, but it was just sailing around the Mediterranean because there was no room in the ports for it to dock, and so the people could get off. And then, yes, take a look at those numbers. Nearly 118,000, and that number's growing, have arrived so far this year. That's more than 2,000 compared to the same time last year. And what that tells you, that this crisis isn't easing.
And huge numbers arriving just this week alone. Why the sudden surge now when summer is almost over?
We're told, so that it's down to the weather, that calm seas mean that more and more men, women and children are tempted to get into the smugglers' boats to reach Europe. And it's also worth remembering that this is one of the most dangerous migrant journeys in the world. This year, nearly 3,000 people have perished or have been lost inside the waters. And as all this happens, there's this fleet of European ships, navies from Germany, Britain, France, Sweden, with their ships trained on the Libyan coast. Their mission is to take on the people smugglers. But there is criticism building that with so many ships there, that it's making the traffickers' lives easier, and that it's acting as a pickup service and exploiting some of the most vulnerable people.
Ed Thomas, thank you. Now, if you became the victim of a crime, how would you feel about meeting the perpetrator? Well, MPs are arguing that all victims of crime in England and Wales should have a legal right to meet those who committed the offence against them. Restorative justice schemes, which allow victims to contact perpetrators in order to repair the harm and find a positive way forward, do already exist. But a committee of MPs say getting access to the schemes is a postcode lottery. Our legal correspondent Clive Coleman has been to meet a victim of crime who went through the process.
My wife and her daughter's upstairs, so I instinctively sort of defended the stairs at this point. And then eventually they hit me so hard I fell backwards through this doorway and into the dining room.
2 years ago, Paul Kohler was attacked in his home and savagely beaten. The 4 Polish men who did this to him had got the wrong man. All were given long prison sentences. But Paul decided he wanted to meet one of them as part of a process known as restorative justice, where a victim can meet or communicate with the person who committed the crime against them to repair the harm done and find a positive way forward.
I felt empowered. To the extent you feel some pity for the person, you see what their life has come to. In the end, we shook hands.
That must have been a curious moment, shaking hands. That was the first time you touched this person since they were beating 7 bells out of you.
Yes, yes. And again, it was important. It was at my instigation. Again, I was in control. It was empowering.
Today's report from the Justice Committee finds that despite recent government initiatives to increase its availability, restorative justice is subject to a postcode lottery. It recommends that the victim's right to restorative justice should be enshrined in legislation, and that greater efforts be made to ensure restorative justice is understood by bodies within the criminal justice system.
The government needs to work to build up the national capacity for restorative justice, and then when they bring in the victims' law that they promised to, that should then be enshrined as a legal right, not just to be told information, but to be offered restorative justice if you want it.
There's little dispute that restorative justice can be positive for victims, reduce reoffending, and so help ease the pressure on prisons. But there are real questions as to whether it should apply in all crimes.
In cases of domestic abuse, what's clear is that restorative justice should only be used when the survivor's safety is absolutely paramount, and when the facilitators have had specialist training to understand domestic abuse and specifically coercive control, so that they ensure it doesn't continue to be perpetrated during the sessions.
The government says it will consider today's report and announce plans to enshrine victims' rights in law in due course. Restorative justice depends on both the victim and the perpetrator agreeing to take part.
I've gotten off my back that idea of you being in charge of me.
But when it works, it can make a real difference. Clive Coleman, BBC News.
A root and branch review of how future referendums are conducted has been called for after a report found that voters in the EU campaign felt ill-informed and deceived. The Electoral Reform Society, which campaigns for changes to Britain's voting system, says the debate failed to address major policies and issues. £20 million is to be spent by the government to try to improve Southern rail services and get to grips with problems on its network. Ministers have announced the measures as services between London, Hampshire, Kent, Surrey and Sussex have been disrupted by a long-running dispute about the role of guards and by staff shortages. The government has also appointed a review board to examine the way the company is operating. Campaigners are calling for a worldwide ban on the ivory trade after a new survey found that Africa's elephant population has declined by a third in the last decade. Researchers have warned that half of Africa's remaining elephants could be gone in 9 years if the current rate of poaching for ivory continues. Our Africa correspondent Alistair Leithhead reports from Nairobi.
Feeding time at an elephant orphanage in Nairobi. Half of these youngsters are here because their mothers were killed by poachers. All will be reintroduced back into the wild, but their future is threatened by the poachers, the traffickers, and by Asia's appetite for ivory.
This particular elephant very close to us here, her name is Roy. She's almost 3 years old and she was rescued from the Masai Mara. And this was after her mother had been killed by poachers. She was found trying to protect the dead body of the mother, who had been killed by poachers, and she was very young.
The first Great Elephant Census, which counted animals across 18 African countries, says a third of the elephants have been wiped out in just 7 years. You see countries like Mozambique, which has lost half its elephants in the last 5 years, Tanzania, 60% of its elephants, other hotspots around the continent, and this big prediction that if things continue as they are, if the poaching rates go on, then half the elephants in Africa will be gone in just 9 years' time. And that's a very depressing picture. Botswana has just discovered a huge number of elephants have been killed for their tusks.
This one's fresh.
With 40% of the continent's elephants, it's been seen as a sanctuary. But like everywhere else, the animals are now under threat.
The cosy pretense that Botswana's elephants are well protected has been completely blown out the water. This is the last thing I expected to see.
Kenya's approach towards conservation was illustrated quite dramatically earlier this year, with the biggest ever ivory burn of the country's stockpile. Despite the high price of black market ivory, campaigners here believe it's worth nothing unless it's left on the elephant.
This report cannot be ignored, that the situation facing elephants is critical, and I doubt that any country in the world would actually support any reopening of trade in ivory.
And that is, you think, the solution to this?
I think that elephants deserve to be unthreatened again in the future. There should be no future ivory trade. It should be a permanent ban.
If the poaching crisis continues, Africa's elephants, roaming wild across vast areas of this continent, could soon become just a memory. Alistair Leithhead, BBC News, Nairobi.
Tennis now, and Britain's Johanna Konta has reached the US Open third round despite dramatically collapsing on court in the New York heat with blurred vision and breathing issues during the match. Britain's Kyle Edmund is also through to the third round. Andy Murray, Dan Evans and Naomi Brody play their second round matches later tonight. Our sports correspondent Joe Wilson reports.
That's Johanna Konta in blue at the top of the screen, looking quite at ease. First set went to the British player 6-2 against Svetlana Pironkova. Useful player, but few opponents hold much fear for Konta these days.
Superb.
Very nice. It was deep in the second set with Pironkova much improved when Konta's own body turned against her. Watch her try to serve and slump.
Floods. And of course the physio.
It was clear she could hardly breathe. Well, Konta said the whole thing was embarrassing. It looks frightening.
Basically, my heart rate spiked, and I couldn't
I couldn't really control my breathing, so I started hyperventilating and I started shaking.
We've seen a number of retirements already, particularly.
Well, Conta had experienced this once before, and she used ice to bring her heart rate down and calm her muscles. As someone once put it in politics, she's a fighter, not a quitter. Conta not only played on, she won.
Holds to love.
Pironkova was sympathetic but wondered about the comfort break Conta also took after her collapse. There was a long delay which ruined Pironkova's rhythm as Conta won the third set 6-2 and thus the match. She reckons she will be okay for the third round. Britain's Kyle Edmund is there too for the first time in a Grand Slam. Having beaten an unseeded American, he's up against John Isner next. It should be as unmissable as his shirt, with luck. Joe Wilson, BBC News.
Time now for a look at the weather with Stav. Hello.
Hi there, Sophie. While we're on the subject of the United States, I thought I'd bring your attention to the tropical storm in the Gulf of Mexico, which has been named Hermine. Now, it's continuing to strengthen, and as it becomes a hurricane later today, it'll be the first hurricane in 11 years to make landfall in Florida as it barrels across the panhandle of Florida and then moves its way northeast along the coast. It could bring significant storm surge, damaging winds, torrential rain with flooding as it continues to move northwards in towards the Carolinas. And a bit of a question mark to how far north it may get into DC or to New York. So this is likely to make headlines. We'll keep you up to date on this. But back home for the 1st of September, and it's looking much quieter. We've got a big ridge of high pressure keeping most of the country fine and settled and dry. But that weather system will continue to bring heavier rain, thicker cloud, outbreaks of pretty torrential rain in some places across the north and the west of Scotland with increasing winds too. But I think eastern Scotland faring best with some brightness. Temperatures here around the high teens Celsius, but for England and Wales, a lovely afternoon with 20 to maybe 25 Celsius across the southeast. Now, that weather front across the northwest begins to sink southwards and eastwards this evening and overnight and ends up across central parts of the UK during Friday morning. So it looks like it'll be quite damp there. Temperature-wise, about 14 or 15 degrees for most. Blustery showers continuing across Scotland. So for Friday then, a cloudier day for England and Wales because of that weather front. There may be the odd heavy burst mixed in, but it looks like it'll be quite sporadic and it won't reach the far southeast until later in the day. So potentially another dry day here with very little rain in the forecast. I know the gardens in the southeast do need that. 22 Celsius here. Brighter with some sunshine further north with blustery showers. Now, the weekend is really giving us a headache. We've got areas of rain which we're quite uncertain about, the timing and the extent of the rain. It's to do with this feature here, which will be moving in off the Atlantic in towards the southwest early on Saturday. But it looks like for many places on Saturday, we start off on a fine note with some sunshine, particularly in the east. And then it turns cloudier, windier and wetter across Wales, southwest of England, expected to spread across the southern half of the UK. Some really heavy bursts mixed in there too. Maybe some useful rain for the gardens of the southeast, whereas further north it should stay brighter. Now that rain moves through during Saturday night, and I think it's looking like Sunday should be the dry and the brighter day of the weekend, but there'll still be a scattering of showers around. Some sunshine too, temperatures 18 to 22 degrees. So remember, for the uncertainty for this weekend, the forecast for the weekend, and for that tropical storm in the United States, you can log on to the BBC weather website for the updates.
Stav, thank you. A reminder now of our main story this lunchtime. The Prime Minister steps into the dispute with junior doctors in England, accusing the British Medical Association of playing politics rather than putting patients first. That's all from us. Now on BBC One, it's time for the news where you are. Bye-bye.